Okay, greetings everyone. Good to see you. Here we are, week three, and we have been sort of moving through some of these major themes, and some of which we could describe as archetypal patterns that are pretty foundational to Hillman's approach, and thus to the whole world of archetypal psychology. And this week, in the spirit of that, leading into our exploration of revisioning psychology, um, we want to look at this pattern of Senex and Puer, and as I hope you'll see, the way in which this then moves into Hillman's distinction between spirit and soul, and his concern to revive a specifically soul-centered perspective and way of thinking. Now, this, well, first of all, Senex and Puer, Latin for old man and young man. And in terms of the broader archetypal pattern here, we're really just talking about old and new in their personified form, or you could say the relationship between the past and the future. And Hillman was very intent on broadening this conversation around the Puer pattern. And the history goes back to a seminar that Marie-Louise von Franz gave in 1959 to 1960, which became her book on the Puer Aeternus, a sort of classic in Jungian psychology. And I want to read a passage from the beginning of that book, because it, in a way, it helps us see what Hillman is pivoting against, because even though, as you may have noticed, he kind of thanks her for her work in this area, in that essay on the Senex and Puer, on another level, he was a little bit ticked off by von Franz's emphasis on the psychopathology of the Puer Aeternus. And I suppose we could say that by definition, the eternal youth, that if a person is caught in that pattern, it is problematic. And the distinction we could make at the beginning is that youthfulness per se is not a problem, but if we're stuck in that youthfulness, if we have a sense of timelessness, for example, in our fantasy of life, that we're not limited by anything, and we can be inspired and live out of that more inspired rather than grounded perspective, that can be problematic. So there is this syndrome, and Hillman's not arguing against that. But to sort of refresh our minds, or perhaps just trigger associations, in the first couple of pages of von Franz's treatment, this is from her book Puer Aeternus, she writes, in general, the man who is identified with the archetype of the Puer Aeternus remains too long in adolescent psychology. That is, all those characteristics that are normal in a youth of 17 or 18 are continued into later life, coupled in most cases with too great a dependence on the mother. And it was particularly this sort of mother-bound psychology that Hillman wanted to reframe, and we'll see that in a moment. But in this classic description of the Puer Aeternus, von Franz goes on He, the Puer, eternally longs for the maternal woman who will enfold him in her arms and satisfy his every need. So there's this very idealistic view of relationships very often. This is often accompanied by the romantic attitude of the adolescent. In some cases, she goes on, there's a kind of asocial individualism, being something special, so that one has no need to adapt. For that would be impossible for such a hidden genius. That's the fantasy very often of the Puer. In addition, an arrogant attitude arises towards other people due to both an inferiority complex and false feelings of superiority, the way those go together. Such people usually have great difficulty finding the right kind of job, for whatever they find is never quite right or quite what they wanted. There's always a hair in the soup. And finally, for us, she says this leads to a form of neurosis, which Baines has described as the provisional life. Maybe you've heard that term. Everything is just dependent upon the sort of changing of circumstances. So she says here, there's a terrific fear of being pinned down, of entering space and time completely, and of being the specific human being that one is. So it reminds me of a good friend of mine, a great person, but like many Puers, died well before his time in his early 30s. And when he and I used to hang out a lot when we were in our early 20s, we sat down one day and counted the number of jobs that he had had, and it was between 40 and 50. So just in the few years, early years of life, he'd moved on. And it was typical of him for each new job or situation to be accompanied by the fantasy of, oh, well, this is the one. I really feel kind of called to that. And so the problem of the Puer Aeternus is a kind of disconnection from the depths. And you'll see this is the shift that Hillman wants to make, that the problem may not be so much with the personal mother and the early childhood history, so much as it is a disconnection from what that mother archetypally represents. So this in the essay, hopefully some of you have been reading the Senex and Puer volume. I think a passage that exemplifies this turn that Hillman makes, we can find on page 50 to 51. And I do want to read a little bit from Hillman today, because not only is he able to just put his finger on these themes, he just writes so beautifully, and so we're getting that mythopoetic dimension that we've been talking about. So he says at the bottom of page 50, the concept Puer Aeternus refers to that archetypal dominant which personifies or is in a special relation with transcendent spiritual powers. Puer figures can be regarded as avatars of the psyche's spiritual aspect, and Puer impulses as messages from the spirit or calls to the spirit. When the collective unconscious in an individual life is represented mainly by parental figures, then Puer attitudes and impulses will show personal taints of the mother's boy, or the fils papa, the daddy's little boy. the perennial adolescence of the provisional life, as he puts it. So he's making this qualification, right? When the relationship to the personal unconscious is only through the parents, and there is no sense of a deeper ancestry or even a sense of psychology, then this is the circumstance in which we get the syndrome of the eternal youth. As he says, then the neurotic foreground obscures the archetypal background. One assumes that the negative and irksome adolescent, right, the lack of progress and reality, is all a puer problem, whereas it is the personal and parental in the neurotic foreground that is distorting the necessary connection to the spirit. So what's he saying here is he said that the puer's nature is sort of pining for these very ephemeral, spiritual, idealistic dimensions of life. But on some level, they're not able to connect that to something deeper, to have it rooted in one's sense of calling or vocation, for example. Then the transcendent call is lived within the family complex, distorted into a transcendent function of the family problem as an attempt to redeem the parents or be their Messiah. The true call, he notes, does not come through or is possible only through technical breakthroughs like drugs or death-defying adventures. So very often you get puer characters being very attracted to transpersonal psychologies, psychedelics, or sort of going off on these great adventures. In other words, sort of shortcuts to places of deep fulfillment. So I think you get the picture here. So the pivot that Hillman makes is, instead of taking the puer eternus and connecting it to this mother complex as von Franz does, Hillman takes the figure of the puer, the youth, and connects it to the senex, the aged one, right? And of course, in the personified form, we're talking about young man, old man, but we're just talking about age and youth. So we could be talking about the puella, for example, and the crone. It's the same pattern, more or less, although, as we might expect, it shows up a little differently in the psychology of men and women. And in this configuration, the problem is not the puer or the senex. It's when this pairing, which he sees as one archetypal pattern, is split. So in other words, when you get the puer, that youthful, exuberant, inspired way of thinking without the senex, without the sense of being grounded in a time and place, or a fidelity to an ancestral call or whatever it is, that's when it becomes problematic, when the puer becomes split off from the senex. And by the same token, the senex, that sort of aged sense of authority, the feeling of history, tradition, and so forth, when that becomes split off from the puer, from the sort of spark of life and inspiration, the freshness, the renewing qualities of the imagination, that also becomes problematic, obviously. And then you get this sort of turgid Saturnian style of consciousness. So what Hillman's doing is putting these two things together and working them from that angle. So I think we get the flavor of that, for example, in a passage, couple of passages on page 35 to 36. He says, our polarities, Senex and Puer, provide the archetype for the psychological foundation of modern history. You see how broad he's going with this, that he's also moving out of the sort of psychology of the individual and doing what he does best, which is taking a lot of psychological problems and a lot of the roots of suffering and anchoring them in something of the cultural and the sort of phases, that cultural historical phases. So first, in the conventional sense, Puer and Senex are history as sequence and transition, as a process through time from beginning to end. And second, history as a problem in which I am caught, for which I suffer, and from which I long to be redeemed. It seems a very important idea right now, right? We seem very caught up today in the historical moment and suffering that. So personified, this is given the name Father Time and Eternal Youth, temporality and eternity, and the puzzling paradoxes of their connection. To be involved with these figures, he says, is to be drawn into history. But to be identified with either is to be dominated by an archetypal attitude toward history. The Puer who transcends history and leaps out of time, and is as such ahistorical or anti-historical in the protest and the revolt. In other words, there's always a greener pasture, and what's actually happening in time is never good enough, so one shouldn't deal with it. Or the Senex, who is an image of history itself and of the permanent truth revealed through history. Now, he's writing this material right on the cusp of the 60s and 70s. And of course, what was going on? Well, this is the great time of the counterculture, right? The arising of this new consciousness, peace and love, and a need for a more spiritual vision, for an embrace of nature and body, and in other words, a reaction to, right, the march of tradition, the march of history, the powers of industrialization, just the sticking to the traditions and the traditional ways of life. So of course, what was going on at that time was this great opening, and I suppose, particularly for people in Hillman's circle, there would have been a massive critique of that as reactionary or neurotic or just ungrounded or defensive. And what Hillman's trying to do is to say, well, hang on a minute, there's something going on here. There's something of value. There's a almost coming from the depths of the psyche itself. There's this impulse to renew, to revision. So he goes on here and says that thus our concern is itself a reflection of the archetype now manifested symbolically in the culture around us and the complexes of our inner world. And the constellation of this polarity as a split demonstrates the gravity of our historical crisis. Therefore, our engagement with this archetype may restore a balance and have an effect on the historical lysis, on how we imagine into this particular moment in history, situating ourselves back at that time. And we could say that since then, we really haven't done too well at resolving this balance between the old and the new. I mean, just think about it in terms of politics and the polarization of the progressive and the conservative sides of politics. Well, there's an example of this Puer Senex pattern at large. So there's a flavor that you get reading through this material of an attempt for Hillman to redeem the Puer. But that redemption isn't a kind of throwing oneself in with the Puer Eternus. It comes with a sizable asterisk, and that is, how do we in the end bring the Senex into relationship with the Puer? And what would that look like? Well, it would look like change that is not completely disconnected from tradition. It would look like a futuristic, right, drive that takes history into account. It would look like a sense of maybe personal and collective power that doesn't forget the gods, right? That doesn't forget the powers of old. So what's key here, and you can see how the collective and the personal come together in this passage on page 37, where he says, the Puer problem of today is not only a collective neurosis, it is a psychic expression of an historical claim, and as such a call. If psychic energy is not able to flow through the usual channels of tradition, it falls inward and activates the unconscious. Now, this is a collective example of the dynamic we're all familiar with. In other words, sometimes when we're living a very ordered, disciplined, systematic life towards some goal, the unconscious decides it's not going to cooperate, and it withdraws its libido and pulls it back into the psyche, and then one suffers a midlife crisis or a depression. But it seems from this depth perspective that what's going on is that the psyche itself is attempting to initiate some kind of renewal. So if psychic energy is not able to flow through the usual external channels of tradition, it falls inward and activates the unconscious. Now, here's the important move. The unconscious as mother, quote unquote, makes it then appear as if all a young person's questioning and maladaptation were his own personal mother complex. But it is a reflection of the transition, and as Jung says, not of our conscious choosing. It reflects the unconscious man within us who is changing. Can this unconscious man be put off until the second half, meaning the second half of life? So here, what Hillman's also challenging here and undoing is this classical Jungian notion that the first half of life is all about like pushing out into the world and running your experiment and creating a family and so forth. And only in the second half of life do we take up the work of reflection and introspection and looking within. For Hillman, I think this is part of the change that he saw developing in the early 70s, where young people, it seemed, were hungering for a deeper perspective, but living it out in these sort of somewhat spiritualized ways. So again, what is the goal here? The transformative possibility lies in that puer impulse reconnecting to a Senex principle of some kind. And you can imagine it, to put it in practical terms, of the person who is inspired, who is imaginative, who has these great ideas, but they need to be able to also apprentice themselves to some kind of discipline, to some kind of perspective, so that they're deepening into something as they're also reaching, right? Reaching for the heights. So just to tell you, the way I got this job of editing this text on the Senex and Puer was that back in the year 2000, there was one of these rather large international conferences on archetypal psychology. There was one in 1992 at the University of Notre Dame. And then in 2000, we had one at the University of Santa Barbara. And I wrote a paper for that conference that argued, taking everything into account that Hillman had written on Puer and Senex, I made the argument that archetypal psychology as a field was too in favor of the Puer and in need of a more positive Senex, meaning it had done well to sort of host all of these interesting little subgroups and so forth. But it hadn't really consolidated its sort of understanding of things. And I like in my imagination to think that the uniform edition is a project. Hillman's decision to want to essentialize his work and bring it into like uniformity. It's a very Senex kind of idea that this in a way came out of this, because when Hillman read my paper, he wrote back to me and he kind of grumbled and said, well, look at my early writings. Look at, yeah, I'm pushing the envelope, for example. I'm challenging the classical Jungian. But he used this word I'll never forget. He said, but look at all the heavy artillery in the footnotes. In other words, look at all of that research, my reach back into history, my trying to underlay my thinking with the history of ideas, for example. That's where the Senex piece comes in, right? And one of the points that I'd made in my critique was that, most of the major contributors to archetypal psychology at that time were already very steeped in one or another particular discipline. It didn't have to be psychology, because people contributed to archetypal psychology from religious studies, from communications, from the theater and the arts world. But they had all kind of put their time in, right? So that's the Senex piece. And now you get to play with these ideas. So anyway, Hillman pushed back, but then I think at the second letter he said, well, I've been wanting someone to pull together this material for a while. Would you be interested in this? And I think that, I mean, he and I had already crossed paths at Pacifica and had a few conversations, but what I took from this is that he enjoyed the argument. He was a person that liked to wrestle with ideas. He wasn't someone who liked followers, quote unquote, like people just coming in behind. So I think that it reminds me, he wrote a paper back, I think in the 80s called, or early 90s, how Jewish is archetypal psychology. And he talks there about the rabbinical style, right? The wrestling with meanings that you get in the Jewish texts and what this is about and what that's about. But you know, this too is a kind of Senex pathway. It's the pathway of really staying with something, wrestling with ideas, and growing down. But nonetheless, when I was working on this textbook, Hillman wanted all these changes. You know, particularly this first essay, he said, oh, this long, turgid piece from years ago, I don't know what to do with it. And finally, I figured out that there were two beautiful pieces towards the end of this article that could be separated off, and I've put them at the very end of this book. But nonetheless, he was going for all the edits, and I said, but, you know, what about the historical record? How important is this for, you know, the roots of the field? Because I do mean what I say in the introduction. I think this material around Senex and Puer is it goes hand in hand with revisioning psychology as a kind of uh, a preparatory text, a kind of setting the ground, setting the stage for this revisioning energy that comes through in that second text. So I just thought I'd share a little bit of that, and it puts this in context. But another piece you might want to check out towards the end of the volume, I took out this section that appears at the end of his best-selling book, The Soul's Code. It's called Coda, a Note on Methodology. And there Hillman says, because if you've read that book, you know he's putting forward this sort of acorn theory that lies between theories of nature and nurture. And he says just at the beginning of this coda, the acorn theory of biography seems to have sprung from and to speak the language of the puer eternus, the archetype of the eternal youth who embodies a timeless, everlasting, yet fragile connection with the invisible otherworld. So there is a strong admission in Hillman, in his work, that this is his own psychology too. He's like all psychologists. Yes, they may be writing something that is generally applicable, or they are responding to the spirit of the times. But Hillman is also trying to work out his own psychology, and he's always had this sort of puer side to him. And I think we can, just before we start talking about spirit and soul, we can deepen into that part of Hillman by looking at the paper, which is the third chapter in the Senex and Puer volume. I know I didn't assign it, but it's only a short piece, if you can get to it, called Notes on Opportunism. And this is where Hillman describes the special relationship that archetypal psychology has to Hermes or Mercury, right? And hence the mercurial style of Hillman, the slipperiness of his ideas, the difficulty we have in really kind of grasping and grounding and systematizing his thinking. And that not only pertains to his interest in so many things, which reflects his psychological polytheism, but also in that he's not really interested in continuity of thought. He writes around what fascinates him. So there's that kind of Puer energy. But to pull the other way, Jung says at some point, he makes a very startling, impressive statement where he says, the god of the unconscious is Mercury. Now, you don't find many places in Jung where he says the god of the unconscious is this or that. So what's he getting at here? Well, I think his point is that in order for us to engage the depths, or what Jungians call the unconscious, which is really what has become unconscious in our psychosocial outlook, that to do that, we need that kind of hermetic dexterity. We need to be able to think symbolically. We need to be able to play with meanings, for example. Think about how Jung got started with his technique of active imagination, playing by the lake in Zurich, building towns and so forth. So in other words, to turn towards the unconscious, we can't simply take the Apollonian pathway, right? Of shooting straight arrows, trying to get clear understandings and so forth. We've got to be able to meander. We've got to be able to move between levels, as Hermes does mythologically. We need the inventiveness of Hermes very often. You know, you may remember from the myth the way he invents the lyre, the musical instrument, by finding a tortoise and getting a tortoise shell and then taking the reeds from somewhere else. And in other words, picking up scraps of this and scraps of that, not constructing something from a plan, but just opportunism, right? Taking the opportunities. How does the unconscious really speak to us? Doesn't it, like, all of a sudden there's an intuition, then there's a synchronicity, then an image pops into our head, then there's a fantasy. And we need that hermetic mercurial energy to be able to work with the psyche. So just, I want to give you just a brief flavor of that too, where he starts off that short essay, Notes on Opportunism, by saying, chance and system are other words for Puer and Senex. Chance and system. Senex consciousness, he says, lives from the plotted curve of expectations. Establishment requires predictabilities. We must plan for eventualities, provide for the future, run no risks. Within a Senex cosmos, chance will either be reduced to meaninglessness, right, by calling it random events, or it's fit into order as statistical probabilities. Otherwise, chance becomes chancy, and those who follow it chances. Opportunity becomes opportunism, and those who follow it opportunists. So this is a very typical Hillman move to say, how does one thing look from the perspective of the other? How does this puer chanciness look from the Senex perspective? And this is what Senex consciousness does to this terrain. Puer existence, however, is based on opportunities, and therefore an archetypal aspect of existence is reflected through this style. We may learn about opportunism. We may learn about opportunism, and it may tell us as well something about the puer aspect of existence. So this, I think, is a wonderful elaboration. And one of the sort of puer, he makes the point here that opportunity has to do with opening. It can be related to the word portal, for example. And so a lot of this essay is a sort of meditation on the idea of kairos time, that time is not just imagined linearly, but qualitatively, and that time itself will in a way pause and ask us to go deeper, that there will be openings in the procession of events. And we can go back then to the very start of the book in the main essay, where he begins with a quote from Jung saying, "We're living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods, of fundamental principles and symbols." So there's two ideas right there, right? That not only is this the right time, but it's a time of change. It's a time of transformation. The gods need to go through something. This peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious within us who is changing. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself through the might of its own technology and science. So, it's also Hillman's doing the work here of trying to read the signs, right? Think of Dylan's music and the way in which that, the times are a changing, and we need to look out, right? Be aware, watch and see what is happening in order to respond to that. Otherwise, these unconscious impulses are going to kind of overtake us. So you can spend more time with that, and the way in which Hermes also brings up the question of living in the communication age. And this is something I want to return to towards the end of the course, too, as an example of working with a particular mythic figure and how it comes into time and space. So we won't do that for now, but it's the point here, I think, is that each of these archetypal figures, you can turn one way and there's a creative potential, and you turn them the other way, or most importantly, you disconnect them from their other side or from their companion gods, and they can become quite destructive. So that sets us up. If we can change gears a little bit, but it, I think, is really continuous, and that is to go to this other distinction that Hillman wants to make. And it is mainly a distinction, but towards the end of his essay, Peaks and Veils, he also talks about how spirit and soul, the distinction we're talking about, how these two facets, huge facets of life come together. So we're in this pattern. And I have to say, I go back to this essay on a regular basis because to me, it tells us so much about what Hillman is trying to do with his soul-centered psychology. That this contrast between spirit and soul and this insight into the way the spirit is what dominates. It's what dominates our psychology. Now, we have the term spirituality, right? And I think that when most people think of spirituality these days, they're not thinking of a purely spiritual perspective. They're thinking about how certain practices, perspectives, beliefs, perhaps, also feed the soul. So it's not an attack on spirituality so much as is attack on this obsession with transcending the stuff of life and moving towards places of purity, for example, and perfection. That these are very traditional spiritual religious fantasies that have the effect of denying the body, right? Dismissing emotional intelligence and intuition, uh, and particularly lifting us up out of what Jung called psychic reality, the level at which fantasy and image is prominent. So that's the flavor of Hillman's concern here, and he anchors his treatment in two councils, two church councils, one in Constantinople in 1869, the other in Nicaea in 787. And in the Council of Nicaea, basically the upshot of that was to ban or to strongly dissuade the engagement with images unless they were the images officially sort of stamped by the church, that the church has its icons, but the iconography of, for example, the individual imagination, that's off the table, right? And so Hillman's making the point here that in one foul swoop, the imagination itself was being shut down in favor of a sort of system of images, right? And in conjunction with that, the later council in 1869 effectively did away with this tripartite model of human experience: spirit, soul, body, or spirit, soul, nature. And this middle realm of soul was effectively pushed to the margins. So instead, we get this dualism, which we all know from thinking about Descartes. But Hillman's saying here that, you know, uh, 6, 7 centuries before Descartes, there was this going on at this level in the Western imagination. So page 72, he just briefly says here, these ancient historical events are responsible for the malnourished root of our Western psychological culture and of the culture of each of our souls. That's pretty powerful, but it underscores the importance of the kind of history of ideas. So he's saying that in Western history, particularly the dominance of the church, the Christianization of thinking, soul and imagination were pushed aside, more or less up until the Renaissance, and then, of course, the coming of depth psychology, where there was an attempt to that he even refers to this as a hatred of the image. And so if you're thinking back to our previous conversation about how soul and image go together, that images are the way in which the soul speaks, that this banishment of images is tantamount to a cutting off of the soul, seen in this psychological way. Or as he put it, the iconoclasts of one, right? In terms of embracing only the officially approved images. And this, incidentally, is why mysticism has always been a thorn in the side of the official church history and story and way of, because if you think about it, like what happens to the mystic experiences their own images of God, images that speak to them directly from the depths. In other words, they experience sensations, visions. Even if sometimes that mysticism has to do with a kind of emptying, you have to say psychologically that's still a way of imagining into God, and it's landing in the particular psyche of the individual, right? And of course, what does the official church do with these things? And so the mystics are either sort of politely tolerated, or sometimes they're denounced as heretics and so on. But it's, of course, to the mystics that the depth psychologists go, of course, to not only see the shadow side of the official Christian uh, line, but also to understand the inner workings, what Jung called the religious function of the psyche. So that's really where the action is. But this distinction, um, again, begins with this idea of perspective. He says, I've spelled all this out, this sort of historical basis on page 75. I've spelled all this out because I want you to know what I'm doing. I'm showing how soul looks at spirit. So again, this isn't someone trying to write in absolute terms, laying down some new metaphysics. He's saying, if we put soul first, we put on the glasses of soul, what does this obsession with the spirit look like? How peaks look from the veil, from within the fantasy world that is the shifting structure of our consciousness and its formulations, which we're always shaped by. We're always shaped by archetypal images. We're always in one or another root metaphor, archetypal fantasy, mythic perspective. Now that in that one sentence, you get archetypal psychology. We are always in one or another root metaphor, archetypal fantasy, mythic perspective. From the soul's point of view, we can never get out of the veil of our psychic reality. Like Jung said, we're in the psyche. The psyche's not in us. But I like this poetic way of putting it. We can never get out of the veil of our psychic reality. We can never get out of our complexes, our history, our sense of calling, and so on. Now, there's a real sort of cracker of a passage here that I think cements this whole piece, from, of all places, the Dalai Lama. And it's almost as if he's handing Hillman the essence of what Hillman's trying to say in this entire paper, where the Dalai Lama himself makes this distinction. But listen to the way that he starts out this quote, page 76. The relation of height to spirituality is not merely metaphorical, it is physical reality. And Hillman makes a point of this because he says, there's something about that spiritual push that also wants to literalize too. It wants to turn things into metaphysical facts rather than psychological images. Dalai Lama going on, the most spiritual people on this planet live in the highest places. So do the most spiritual flowers. I call the high and light aspects of my being spirit, and the dark and heavy aspects soul. Soul is at home in the deep shaded valleys. Heavy, torpid flowers saturated with black grow there. The rivers flow like warm syrup. They empty into huge oceans of soul. Spirit is a land of high white peaks and glittering jewel-like lakes and flowers. Life is sparse and sound travels great distances. There is soul music, soul food, soul dancing, soul love. Right? A contrast. And then he says at the end of this quote, people need to climb the mountain not simply because it is there, but because the soulful divinity needs to be mated with the spirit. So he, at the end, is sort of looking at it from the reverse perspective, as you would imagine. One of the world's most spiritual people, from this great land in the mountains, and from the whole tradition of stepping apart, stepping out of life. Hillman amplifies here a little bit in a minute too, but nonetheless, he's acknowledging that soulful divinity needs to be mated with the spirit. And Hillman gets to that too. So this bias towards the spirit is in our traditional religiosity that often comes without a psychology, that comes with a program of, in a way, lifting ourselves up, transcending the sort of everyday, shadow realities of life and so forth. And so, this bias to the spirit needs compensation, culturally, historically speaking. And we could say that Hillman's whole soul-based psychology is itself a compensation to this way of looking at things. And of course, as you know, the obsession with purity and perfection that we get, particularly in a lot of fundamentalist religions, is very soul-destroying, if not problematic in a very gross, out there ways, when fundamentalism turns into fanaticism and people feel like because they have the truth that they've gotten high enough to be like this with God, that then that they can impose that on others. Whereas obviously in a soul-centered perspective, we have to look at religious truths symbolically. imaginistically and put them in cultural, historical context. It's a whole other problem. So Hillman describes what happens, and this is apt for him to do. What happens when we do detach the two, and spiritual pursuits are not rooted in soulful ways of knowing? An example would be this sort of whole aesthetic tradition. As he says on page 78, the desert saint attempted to reverse the psychological effects of the ancient religion. His discipline aimed to separate the monk from his human community and also from nature, both of which were of vital importance to the polytheistic religion, in which the divine and human interpenetrated everywhere. So you start to see the way in which these ideas are massaging one another, because in Hillman's thinking, at least, the more you descend into the veils of soul, the more your sense of the psyche kind of goes back towards the instinctual, the more you're going to be in that way of thinking where the gods are in things, right? The gods are in our emotional impulses. The gods are in the way nature comes to us in the outer world. The gods don't belong to some transcendent place. So the discipline aimed to separate the monk from his human community and from nature, both of which were of vital importance to the polytheistic religion, in which divine and human interpenetrated everywhere. That is, in the valley, not only in the peak or the desert. By living in a cave, the burial place of old religion, the desert saint performed a mimesis of death, right? A sort of constant repeating ritualistically. The rigors of his spiritual discipline, its peculiar postures, fasting, insomnia, darkness, these rigors helped him withstand the assault of the demons or ancestral influences of the dead, as well as his personal and cultural history. You see, it's not that there isn't a place for these things and for this kind of monastic way of life. But as any psychological minded person will tell you about monasteries, they're a hothouse of psychological problems, because it's as if the soul itself goes into the shadow, the appetites, the desires, the fantasies, and so forth. And so this is the reality that we have to deal with. So Hillman says, you will have noticed that the turn away from sleep and dreams, and from nature and community, away from personal ancestral history and polytheistic complexity, these factors from which the spiritual disciple works to be free give specific indications about the nature of the soul. In other words, we get to know the soul by what has been discarded. So I'm just noticing the time, and to pull all this together, as I said, he's not, just as he's not wanting a Puer only psychology, he's not wanting a soul only psychology. What's the end game? Well, our revived sense of soul is what would in the end allow the soul spirit marriage, or as he says, the Puer psychic psyche marriage. And this is also the psychological medicine for the puer impulse, to marry that sort of inspired constant possibility, constantly moving out, with the inner world, the interiority, to be able to psychologize one's impulses and understandings, to reflect. It's not a literal grounding that the puer needs, it's a psychological grounding, right? To come back into the soul. So I just want to finish with this passage on page 86, where he illustrates this. He says, the spirit needs to witness madness. Like, where is our madness? Or to put it another way, the puer takes its drive and goal literally unless there is reflection, which makes possible a metaphorical understanding of its drive and goal. By bearing witness as the receptive experiencer and imager of the spirit's actions, the soul can contain, nourish, and elaborate in fantasy the puer impulse, bringing its sensuousness and depth. Involve it in life's delusions, care for it for better or for worse. Then the individual in whom these two components are marrying begins to carry with him or her their own reflective mirror and echo. They become aware of what their spiritual actions mean in terms of the psyche. See, I think that's it. Both in terms of the spiritual propensity in religion and the puer propensity in life, the ability to think about these things in terms of what they mean for the soul. What do they mean psychologically? The spirit turned towards psyche rather than deserting it for high places and cosmic love, finds even further possibilities of seeing through the opacities and obfuscations in the valleys. Sunlight enters the veil. The word participates in gossip and chatter. The word, capital W, participates in gossip and chatter. So just to end, the spirit asks that the psyche help it, not break it or yoke it or put it away as peculiarity or insanity. And it asks that analysts who act in psyche's name not turn the soul against the puer adventure, but rather to prepare the desire of both for each other. That these two things in the end are in need of confluence, right? Not quite the union that we think about in classical Jungian thought, but to be involved in a partnership, right? To be involved in a kind of dance together, most optimally. And this is Hillman's somewhat different way of thinking about opposites. So I've gone over time, which is probably giving Gallery a headache of some description. She's giving me the okay, but let's stop and pause and see where we're at and see how these ideas sitting with you.